In South Carolina, the death chamber had been silent for more than a decade. For 13 years, no executions took place. Appeals, legal battles, and shortages of lethal injection drugs brought everything to a standstill. But in September 2024, that silence ended. The man at the center of it all was Freddie Eugene Owens, a case shaped by a tragic killing inside a Greenville convenience store, years of courtroom reversals, and the violent choices he made behind prison walls. His execution would not only mark the end of his life, it would reopen a chapter the state had closed for years, forcing a community, a justice system, and a nation to confront what happens when punishment, violence, and time collide. This is the story of the crime, the trial, the years of appeals, and the return of capital punishment to South Carolina, told in 5 chapters. If you enjoy real, gripping prison documentaries and true stories, don't forget to like this video, leave a comment, and share it with your friends and family. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss more shocking and exclusive content. The night that changed everything. The story begins in Greenville, South Carolina, in 1997, a city balancing industrial growth, small-town familiarity, and the quiet routines of everyday life. Late at night, most businesses had already closed. Only a few places stayed open, the kinds of stores people stop at for fuel, cigarettes, or a snack before heading home. One of those places was a small neighborhood convenience store, where a clerk worked the late shift, doing a job that often feels invisible until something goes wrong. On that night, a robbery unfolded inside the store. What began as an attempt to steal money turned into something irreversible. During the encounter, the clerk, Irene Granger Graves, was shot and killed. The crime left a family grieving, a community shaken, and investigators searching for answers. From that point forward, the name Freddie Eugene Owens would become tied to the case. Owens was 19 years old at the time, young, already entangled in a world of crime and instability, surrounded by influences and choices that narrowed his path rather than expanding it. Investigators identified him and others believed to be connected to the robbery. The case moved quickly. Witnesses were interviewed. Evidence was gathered. The weight of the charge, murder during the commission of a robbery, placed Owens directly on a path toward the most severe punishment available under state law. The courtroom where his trial took place carried an atmosphere familiar to capital cases. Jurors sat positioned in silence, the air thick with formality and consequence. Prosecutors described the crime as senseless and unforgivable. They framed the killing as deliberate, anchored to the decision to enter that store with a weapon during a robbery. The defense tried to raise doubt and context, youth, environment, influence, but the outcome came down to the facts presented and the emotional reality of a life lost. The jury returned a verdict, guilty. During the penalty phase, the prosecution sought the death penalty, arguing that the crime met the standard for capital punishment. The jury agreed. Owens was sentenced to death in 1999, but the story didn't end there. It rarely does in capital cases. Appeals followed. Rulings were overturned, then reinstated. Different courts revisited questions about evidence, jury instructions, and legal procedure. His sentence was vacated and later restored more than once. Each reversal gave the case new momentum. Each reinstatement returned it to the same conclusion. While those legal battles played out, another violent event occurred, this time inside the jail. Not long after his conviction, while awaiting further proceedings, Owens killed another inmate. The confession read later in court reinforced the narrative prosecutors built, a pattern of violence, a person capable of lethal harm beyond one tragic moment. From that point on, his case carried 2 tragedies, the life lost at the store and another life lost inside a correctional setting. The courts did not ignore this. Judges and jurors heard about it, and it strengthened the argument that his original sentence should stand. Years passed. Appeals continued. Owens changed his name while incarcerated, reflecting a spiritual and identity shift, something that often happens in long-term confinement. Supporters described him as reflective, evolving, attempting to reshape who he was. But for the families of those lost, the past could not be rewritten. The legal system remained focused on accountability and the original harm. Meanwhile, outside the prison walls, South Carolina's execution system entered a new era of uncertainty. By 2011, the state could no longer obtain the drugs needed for lethal injections. Executions stopped. 13 years went by without a single one carried out. During that time, lawmakers debated methods, rewrote statutes, and passed new laws to allow secrecy around how drugs were obtained. For men on death row, including Owens, the pause created a suspended reality. Sentences existed on paper, but they were not being carried out. Appeals overlapped with policy debates. Time passed, but nothing moved forward. Eventually, the state restored its execution procedures. Once the legal and logistical barriers were removed, attention returned to the people whose sentences had been pending for years. Owens became the first scheduled execution, the case chosen to mark the end of the long gap. By then, the crime was decades old, yet its emotional impact remained. The family of Irene Granger Graves had lived with the absence for nearly 3 decades. The legal record was thick with filings, orders, and transcripts. Owens was no longer the 19-year-old who walked into that store. He was middle-aged, shaped by years of confinement, legal struggle, and the slow movement of capital litigation. As his execution date approached, last-minute efforts emerged to halt the process, including statements and claims challenging elements of the original case. Courts reviewed them, weighed the evidence against the record, and declined to intervene. The sentence would proceed. Before that final chapter unfolded, one truth remained constant. This story was built on loss. The loss of a life inside a quiet convenience store, the loss of another life inside a jail, and the profound consequences that radiate outward when violence enters ordinary spaces. Chapter 1 closes with the moment before the state moves forward, the end of years of waiting, and the beginning of the final stage in a case that had already defined so many lives. After the trial and the death sentence, the story did not move in a straight line. It entered the long, complicated world of appeals, a place where time stretches, where outcomes shift, and where every filing carries the weight of a life and a crime that cannot be undone. For Freddie Eugene Owens, the courtroom did not disappear after his conviction. Instead, it followed him into the years ahead. His case moved from one court to another, from trial courts to state appeals courts, and then into the federal system. Each motion, each hearing, and each legal decision reopened the past, examined it, and determined whether the original sentence would stand. The appeals focused on issues familiar in capital cases, how the jury heard the evidence, the instructions they received, and whether every constitutional rule had been followed. At times, courts found flaws significant enough to overturn aspects of the sentence. At other times, higher courts reinstated the decisions, affirming that the outcome should remain what the jury originally decided. This back and forth created a sense of uncertainty that stretched across years. For the victim's family, it meant reliving the case again and again. For Owens, it meant existing in a state of suspension, not free, not finished, and not yet facing the finality of the sentence. Inside prison, life took on a different rhythm. Days were structured by routines, counts, movement schedules, and the quiet, contained world of secure facility. The isolation of death row creates distance from ordinary life. Time becomes something measured less by clocks and more by appeals, hearings, and the arrival of legal mail. During this period, the earlier violence inside the jail, the killing of another inmate, remained part of the legal record. When prosecutors revisited the case during later proceedings, that act reinforced their argument that the sentence should remain in place. It stood as a separate wound, another point of pain, and another factor shaping how courts viewed the question of punishment. Meanwhile, Owens went through personal shifts during his years in custody. He changed his name and adopted a spiritual identity that reflected inward searching, a desire to redefine himself, and an attempt to understand his place in the world after so much time inside the system. Supporters described him as someone who had matured, who reflected deeply on his life and the consequences of his past. But legal outcomes do not revolve on personal change alone. Courts return to records, facts, and rulings, not to who a person hopes they have become over time. Outside prison walls, the broader context of executions in South Carolina was changing. By 2011, the state no longer had access to the drugs required for lethal injection. Without them, executions could not be carried out. What followed was a 13-year stretch with no executions at all, a pause that was not declared formally, but existed in practice. Lawmakers debated how to respond. Some argued for new methods. Others questioned the process itself. Policies were rewritten, procedures redesigned, and laws were introduced to allow secrecy around the suppliers of execution drugs. The system shifted, not quickly, but slowly, through legislative sessions, court challenges, and administrative changes. For people on death row, that pause created a strange reality. Sentences remained in place, but the system could not enforce them. Appeals continued, but the endpoint stayed distant. Some men waited years without knowing whether the state would ever resume executions or whether policy changes would alter their fate entirely. For Owens, those years were marked by legal filings, reflections, and the continuation of a case that had never truly closed. The events of 1997 remained at the center of every document and every ruling. The family of Irene Granger Graves continued to live with the absence left behind. The system moved slowly, but the grief tied to the crime did not. Eventually, after years of debate, the state restored pathways to carry out executions again. Once the legal barriers were removed and the process was reinstated, attention returned to the cases that had been waiting in the background, the ones that had traveled through years of appeals and remained unresolved only because the method of execution had been unavailable. Owens became the first case scheduled under the renewed system. The decision drew attention not only because of the crime, but because of what it represented: the end of a 13-year period without executions in South Carolina. As the date approached, his legal team continued filing motions, introducing new statements, new claims, and challenges rooted in questions about evidence and responsibility. Courts reviewed the submissions carefully, comparing them to records that stretched back decades. Ultimately, judges concluded that the filings did not outweigh the established findings of the case. Stays were denied. Appeals were closed. For those watching, families, legal observers, and members of the public, the moment marked a collision between past and present. The crime had taken place in the late 1990s. The legal process had moved across nearly 3 decades. The man who now stood on the edge of execution was no longer 19 years old. The world outside prison had changed again and again while the case remained in motion. Yet the loss at the heart of the story had never faded. By the time the final rulings were issued, the system had reached the end of its long, procedural road. What began inside a small convenience store had traveled through courtrooms, appellate chambers, prison corridors, and years of legal argument. The case had touched every level of the justice process. Chapter 2 closes at the threshold of the final phase, the point where the appeals have ended, the schedule is set, and the state prepares to carry out a sentence delayed not only by law, but by time itself. As the execution date drew near, the long stretch of legal motions and court arguments gave way to something quieter and heavier. The years of uncertainty were replaced by a fixed point on the calendar, a day and an hour when the sentence would finally be carried out. For everyone connected to the case, the final days carried a different kind of weight than any court hearing or appeal ever had. Inside Broad River Correctional Institution, the environment tightened around routine. Processes that had not been used in more than a decade were brought back into motion. Staff reviewed procedures, checked protocols, and prepared the facility for something that had not happened in South Carolina in 13 years. The return of an execution was not just a legal event. It was an operational shift for an institution that had lived through a long pause. For Freddie Eugene Owens, the final days unfolded in a controlled, deliberate environment. Life became more restricted, movement more limited, and interactions more structured. In these final days, time does not pass quickly. It slows, becoming noticeable in smaller details. Conversations with attorneys, quiet hours in a cell, the sound of doors opening and closing somewhere down the corridor. Outside the prison, emotions moved along different lines. For the family of Irene Granger Graves, the execution date meant revisiting a loss that had never gone away. Decades had passed since the night of the crime, yet grief lives differently than time. It stays, returning in waves, resurfacing whenever the case moves into public attention. The execution was not just a legal conclusion to them. It was another reminder of someone they loved, someone whose absence shaped their lives. There were others who followed the case from a different perspective. Legal observers, advocates, and members of the public saw the execution through broader questions: punishment, responsibility, and the role of the state in taking a life. The return of executions after 13 years brought debate and reflection, even among those not directly connected to the case. In the final stretch before the sentence, last-minute filings continued to arrive. Owen's legal team submitted additional claims and statements, raising questions they believed were still unresolved. Courts reviewed them under urgency, measuring new material against decades of records and testimony. Judges acknowledged the seriousness of the moment, but ultimately, the rulings stayed firm. The courts declined to halt the execution. Inside the facility, preparations remained measured and procedural. The spaces connected to the execution process, hallways, secured rooms, monitored waiting areas, carried a restrained, formal atmosphere. Staff members were trained to approach the moment with precision and distance, following policy rather than emotion. Even so, the return of executions after so many years meant that many people working inside the prison were walking through an experience they had only studied, not lived. For Owens, communication in the final days narrowed. Letters, visits from attorneys, and restricted conversations took on greater significance. The distance between who he had been at 19 and who he had become after decades in prison sat quietly in the background, present, but unable to change the legal reality of the case. Some saw him as someone who had reflected, changed, and aged inside the system. Others saw him only through the harm connected to his actions, the death inside the convenience store, and the violence that occurred later inside the jail. Those different views never fully aligned, and in the final days, they existed side by side without resolution. Meanwhile, the wider public became aware that South Carolina was preparing to carry out its first execution in more than a decade. News coverage framed the moment through history, policy, and controversy. Commentators discussed the return of capital punishment, the years-long pause, and the legal environment that allowed executions to resume. For many, the case represented more than one man. It symbolized the reopening of a chapter the state had left untouched for years. But inside the story itself, the human reality remained smaller and more personal. A family who lost someone in 1997. Another life lost inside a correctional setting. A man who had lived most of his adult years inside prison walls. A legal system that had moved, paused, and then restarted. As the scheduled day approached, the emotional presence of time became almost physical. The years between the crime and the execution did not erase anything. They only layered reflection, memory, and history onto an event that had never truly left the lives it affected. The night before an execution carries a quiet weight inside a prison. There is no spectacle, no dramatic movement, just routine carried out with deliberate calm. The atmosphere is restrained, controlled, procedural. For staff, it is a duty. For the person facing execution, it is the final narrowing of experience into hours. Beyond the walls, the families on both sides felt the approach of the moment in different ways. Some held onto remembrance, memories of ordinary days before violence disrupted their lives. Others focused on faith, survival, or endurance after years spent in the shadow of a case that never faded from view. By the time morning turned into evening on the day of the execution, the path of the case had reached its last stage. Decades of filings, hearings, reversals, reinstatements, delays, and arguments had converged into a single point in time. Chapter 3 ends at the moment before the state carries out the sentence, a space where time slows, where emotion sits alongside procedure, and where the lives touched by the crime, the trial, and the years of waiting meet the reality of what comes next. On the evening when the sentence was scheduled to be carried out, Broad River Correctional Institution moved through its procedures with measured control. For the first time in 13 years, the state of South Carolina was preparing to carry out an execution. The return of the process was not marked by noise or spectacle. It unfolded quietly, inside secure corridors, behind doors that had remained unused for more than a decade. The facility operated with a structured calm. Staff followed written protocols designed to reduce uncertainty and prevent errors. Supervisors reviewed checklists. Roles were assigned. Officials and observers were placed in designated areas. The atmosphere reflected distance and restraint, an environment focused on procedure rather than emotion. For Freddie Eugene Owens, the moments leading up to the execution took place within that framework. Movement was limited, supervision constant, and communication formal. The system treated the process as administrative, but the human reality behind it was impossible to separate from the quiet around it. Owens was no longer the 19-year-old at the center of the original case. He was a middle-aged man who had spent most of his adult life inside prison walls, shaped by time, confinement, and a long legal road that led to this point. Witnesses allowed by law, officials, members of the media, and individuals connected to the case were present in separate viewing areas. Their role was not participatory. They observed, recorded, and documented, becoming part of the historical record of a sentence that had been debated, appealed, overturned, reinstated, and finally enforced after decades of uncertainty. Outside the prison, the world took on a different tone. News crews waited beyond the perimeter. Statements from supporters and critics of capital punishment circulated publicly. Some people viewed the execution as closure for a crime that left deep harm in its wake. Others saw it as a sobering reminder of a system that exercises power over life and death. Across these divided perspectives, the moment remained heavy, slow, and deeply human. Inside the facility, the final steps were deliberate and structured. Owens was given the opportunity, as procedure allows, to make a final statement. Reports later noted that he declined to deliver one. What little he did say was brief, restrained, and personal, directed toward his attorney rather than the room. There were no dramatic gestures, no heightened displays of emotion. The scene reflected the tone of the entire process, solemn, procedural, and controlled. The method used was lethal injection, reinstated after years of legal and logistical barriers. The process took place under supervision, in accordance with state policy, and without outward disruption. Observers described a quiet, steady environment rather than movement or struggle. Medical personnel monitored the situation, and after a period of time, Owens was pronounced dead. At that point, the execution was complete. The room remained still. Officials recorded times, verified procedures, and followed post-execution protocols. The moment marked the conclusion of a sentence first handed down in 1999, carried through multiple reversals and reinstatements, and ultimately enforced in 2024. Beyond the walls, news of the execution spread quickly. Headlines emphasized two realities at once: the end of Owens' case and the fact that South Carolina had resumed executions after a 13-year pause. The story was not only about one man or one crime. It was about the return of a process that had been dormant for more than a decade. For the family of Irene Granger Graves, the execution did not erase loss or repair the damage that began on the night of the crime. Their grief existed outside the timeline of courts and legal documents. For them, the moment was tied to memory, to the life of someone they loved, and to the years they lived without her. For the broader public, the event reopened conversations about justice, responsibility, and punishment. Some viewed the execution as accountability, a sentence carried out after long review. Others questioned whether the passage of time, the years of appeals, and the evolution of the man who was executed should have changed the outcome. These perspectives did not resolve into a single narrative. They remained parallel, existing side by side, shaped by personal beliefs, lived experience, and moral conviction. Inside the criminal justice system, the execution marked the operational return of a mechanism that had been absent for years. The staff who worked that night carried out a function rooted in policy and law, not personal discretion. For many of them, it was the first time they had seen the process move from preparation to completion. The experience would remain with them as part of their professional and human memory. For those who knew Owens only through the records of the case, he existed as a defendant, an inmate, and a man connected to two deaths, one inside a convenience store and one inside a correctional environment years earlier. For those who encountered him later in life, he was also a person who changed, reflected, and aged in confinement. The execution did not resolve these contradictions. It closed the legal chapter while leaving the human questions open. By the end of the night, the prison returned to routine. The corridors grew quiet again. Paperwork was completed. Doors closed. The institution shifted back into its ordinary rhythm. Scheduled counts, movement restrictions, and the controlled order of daily operations. But beyond the walls, the story continued. The execution became part of the state's historical record, the first after a long pause, the beginning of a new era of capital punishment in South Carolina, and a turning point in a case that had stretched across nearly 3 decades. Chapter 4 closes in that aftermath, where the legal process has reached its end, the sentence has been carried out, and the weight of the story passes from action into memory. With the execution complete, the state of South Carolina had officially returned to enforcing capital punishment after a 13-year hiatus. For some, it was a moment of closure, a long-delayed consequence delivered after decades of legal wrangling. For others, it was the start of questions about morality, justice, and the role of the state in taking life. Inside Broad River Correctional Institution, the day after the execution carried a muted rhythm. Guards resumed their daily rounds. Cell doors opened and closed with the same measured cadence as always. Hallways remained quiet, with only shadows moving against the walls. For staff, the execution was recorded, verified, and archived. Operationally, it was complete. Emotionally, the impact lingered quietly in the corners of the facility, in the faces of those who had seen the system resume a function it had not performed in more than a decade. For the family of Irene Granger Graves, closure was complex. The execution could not restore a life lost, erase years of grief, or make sense of the violence that had entered their lives in 1997. Still, some felt a measure of relief that the sentence had been carried out. The passage of time had softened some of the immediate pain, but grief, memory, and absence remained as permanent threads. The legal and social implications extended beyond one family or one crime. The execution reopened the dialogue around capital punishment in South Carolina. Questions arose about fairness, consistency, and the timing of justice. Was justice served when decades had passed? Could a man who had changed over time be judged in the same terms as the 19-year-old who entered that convenience store? These questions had no easy answers, yet they formed part of the broader context surrounding the return of the death penalty. For Owens himself, the life he led inside prison, long and introspective, came to a definitive end. The man who had committed a violent act as a teenager, the man who had killed again while incarcerated, and the man who had spent decades navigating appeals and reflection, was gone. What remained were legal records, archival footage, court filings, and memories held by people connected to the case. The human presence that had inhabited those decades of waiting now existed only in story and record. Beyond the prison walls, public response was muted yet reflective. News outlets documented the execution factually, avoiding sensationalism, while commentators debated the broader meaning of capital punishment in modern society. The 13-year pause added historical weight. It was not just one case, but the first instance in a new era where executions were once again possible in South Carolina. Observers noted that the state had prepared carefully, structured the process, and carried it out with restraint, acknowledging the ethical and procedural gravity of ending a life under law. Within the system itself, lessons were recorded, procedures were updated, training reinforced, and the experience became part of the institutional memory. This was more than bureaucracy. It was a recognition that the weight of human life, crime, and punishment moves through the prison, the courtroom, and the broader community in ways that persist long after any single event. The story of Freddie Eugene Owens serves as both a record of individual actions and a reflection on the systems that respond to them. It is a story about crime, punishment, and consequence, but it is also a story about time. Decades passed between the original act, the legal processes, and the final execution. In that time, lives changed, identities shifted, laws evolved, and the machinery of justice waited for circumstances to allow action. It is a reminder that justice is rarely simple, swift, or free of moral complexity. For historians, legal scholars, and the public, the case will endure as part of the historical record of South Carolina. It illustrates the tension between law and human experience, the weight of delayed punishment, and the ways in which personal tragedy intersects with societal systems. The execution ended a chapter in legal procedure, but it did not erase the broader consequences, grief, reflection, and debate that will continue in communities, institutions, and individual memories. Ultimately, Chapter 5 closes with reflection. The execution of Freddie Eugene Owens marked the resumption of capital punishment in a state long absent from the practice, but it also underscores the enduring human questions surrounding life, death, and justice. The case leaves a legacy that is procedural, historical, and profoundly human, a reminder of the consequences of choice, the slow passage of law, and the lives forever altered by acts of violence. The silence that followed the execution was both literal and symbolic. The quiet of the prison corridors mirrored the stillness of time after decades of waiting. Outside, conversation continued, reflection persisted, and history recorded the event as part of a larger narrative about crime, punishment, and the moral weight carried by those entrusted with enforcing the law. In the end, the story is neither sensational nor simple. It is the story of a crime, of a sentence, and of the human impact that stretches across decades, a record of the lives affected, the system that administered justice, and the enduring consequences of decisions made in a few moments of violence.